Welcome to Thursday, the third day of October 2024. It's the same weather, it's just a different day in terms of how things are going to roll with the weather. And really, this comment of same weather, different day is going to be how it goes here for another week or a little bit longer than that. So we'll continue to have to be concerned about, like what you're seeing in the photo here, the smoke from the elk fire making for very pretty sunset photo, but fire conditions are going to remain sky high across the Intermountain West through the weekend and through next week. So we'll need to continue to exercise extreme caution as warm and windy periods are going to continue. This sort of back and forth where we have a windy day, then the winds let up the next, then we get windy again, then they let up. This back and forth will continue as systems move right along the U.S.-Canadian border. That just is going to be what we've had. This is what we're going to have for a little bit longer. We're going to be looking at this through the rest of this week, through the weekend, and next week's weather is basically going to be the same. Now, by next weekend, there's a little bit of a change in the weather pattern. I wouldn't call it a dramatic change, but maybe a hint of other changes to come, kind of like a situation to where this change is a signal that bigger changes are coming a bit later. And we'll see that by next weekend. And as we mentioned yesterday, we're going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence versus deterministic models, which what I show you every day on this podcast is a deterministic model, which basically makes some assumptions on how the atmosphere works. You put the inputs in, the observations, but it's just kind of a one-shot deal in terms of how the weather is going to be over time versus the artificial intelligence modeling that's coming out more and more these days. Unfortunately, the fire continues to rage there. The fire activity in northern and western Wyoming continues to go, and Mother Nature is not helping out. The only thing that's helping out are these longer nights and shorter days, and that's just because of, well, that's what happens this time of year. So we have a lot of not only bored weather people, but these horses are just not impressed either. And when you take a look at how things can change very quickly, here's a shot of the Tetons from the air and then smoke coming in a little bit later. So the smoke and haze is going to be something that's going to be on the lookout for. Speaking to be on the lookout for, the comet showing up, still very low on the horizon, but the bigger show is coming later this month, especially after the 12th of October, and we'll get to that later. In fact, there's not only one comet, there's two. A new comet has appeared. We'll talk about that as we get a little bit closer. I took a little bit of a wider perspective on the satellite image this morning and put it in motion just to continue to show us that there's a lot going on here in the North Pacific, from the Gulf of Alaska through the Aleutians, across the North Central Pacific, where this semi-permanent area of low pressure in this blocking pattern continues. So we'll continue to see, as you see these high clouds streaking into Western Canada, but a big area of high pressure right here over the central and western United States has formed in response to this big low. So all the weather is going to go up there from Mexico to Montana, and then from really most of the Pacific Northwest down into the Baja. There's just nothing going on. And this is why. This area of low pressure is here, this area of low pressure over Hudson Bay, and high pressures in between. Strong jet stream winds aloft continue to move overhead and get closer, and this strong gradient in temperature aloft leading to strong winds aloft, which means when they move perpendicular to the Cotton-Hill Divide, you're going to have windy periods. And this is certainly going to be the case as we get into tomorrow and Saturday. Winds pick up in response to that little wave moving right along the U.S.-Canadian border. There'll be precipitation along and north of that low, windy conditions south of that low, and temperatures that will fluctuate a little bit. So it's the same situation. These are the wind gusts between today and Sunday. So it's going to be quite windy across North Dakota, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Montana, and the wind-prone areas of Wyoming, but even getting back into Idaho and parts of the northern Bighorn Basin, rather the Great Basin. So you can see plenty of wind along the path of those lows. And there's really nothing that's going to change that. So we'll have to be dealing with bouts of wind. And you can see we have windy areas in the fire areas. So just not what you want to see. Strong winds at times along the Interstate 80 corridor. So we got to be extremely careful let's hope that we don't get anything else started up here. When we take a look at precipitation between now and Sunday, nothing, really, barely anything across the region, except where that moisture is getting pushed on shore here into British Columbia and parts of the Pacific Northwest. This is just literally a strong flow of moist air into the higher terrain, and that's forcing out precipitation. But you get east of the Cascades, you can see the line there, east of the Canadian Rockies, you're just not going to get much. As we take a look at what may happen by next weekend, so I'm already jumping to the 12th of October, what looks to happen is that one of these lows coming off the, let's call this is the big low that spins off the little ones. We're going to see one maybe take a little bit of a detour more towards California and the Great Basin. Now, when this happens, notice it's cut off from the colors up here. So it's not going to drag in anything terribly cold. But we may see by next weekend a little bit of a low come into the west. There'll be some weather with it, not a lot, but some. But when we start to see this, that means that maybe upstream things are going to start to change a little bit. And that's what we'll talk about now, is when are those bigger changes coming? We gave you a hint. It was likely going to be a little bit after this time period of after next weekend. So let's take a look at the deterministic European model that goes out to 15 days. So this basically goes out to Friday, the 18th of October. So we're already that far out before we see anything that really is going to change much. What we have is we still have that low in the Gulf of Alaska. However, it's being displaced now a little bit more to the east. And you see this pink area right here? This is an area of high pressure that the models want to see forming a little bit further east into the Pacific and bulging northward up here a little bit. Then notice this tight gradient, how the tightness of those black lines are. This is a really strong jet stream wind, but it's not directed towards Canada anymore. It's directed southeastward into the western United States. Also notice we have high pressure building along the east coast. This low pressure goes up into here. So basically what this means, what the model is seeing here, is that eventually around or after the 17th, 18th of October, the western part of the United States is going to be in better position for this to move in and this high pressure ridge to build up here. So what we're looking at is this model is built from all the balloons that go up twice a day, all the satellite data, all the things that we use to input into the models is put into the model, and then it's taken forward in time. And it's taken forward in time by 2 weeks. And that's what's supposed to happen. That's the way the atmosphere is supposed to respond to form this pattern based on just that one set of inputs. So we call this a deterministic model, and this is what we use most of the time. Now, with the artificial intelligence that's coming on now, we have the ability to use artificial intelligence to maybe say, all right, is there a better way to do this? Because this deterministic model uses inputs of measured weather. It doesn't put into, at least to a large degree, what we call climatological components, which means, well, does this weather pattern make sense based on what we've seen in the past? Is there anything to counterbalance what the model says should happen based on what we know has happened before? And I talk about analog forecasting techniques all the time, which is, does the model make sense to what has happened in the past? So what AI is doing is it's doing exactly that, which I think is very smart, which is, okay, the model sees something based on the inputs we put in, but is the model representative of really what has happened before? And that's what AI does. So for the same forecast time period, for the exact same time, the deterministic model sees this for the 18th, AI sees this. Now you might look at that and say, well, there's some big differences there. Obviously there are, but the same premise is a tight gradient here, the lows further west in the Gulf of Alaska, and we still have this area of low pressure here. So if we look back and forth, yes, they look different, but structurally, it's showing basically the same thing here. Now, what the AI does is it takes this model, and then it goes back in time to the late 1940s when we can actually put together some weather history that we feel confident about. So it goes back to, let's say, roughly 1950, and it looks at all the weather patterns, and it says, is this situation that we see right here, does that make sense with what we see in the past? And if it doesn't, what have we seen in the past when we merge the model with the past and we get this? So this is a very clever way of being able to counterbalance the model and say, what has history shown us? And this is a really clever way to use AI. Does this mean AI is going to be the savior of weather forecasting and put somebody like me out of business? The answer is probably not, at least in the short term. The reason is this. There's two big weaknesses to the AI when it comes to the modeling and the weather forecasting. One is it's using a model as the base, which means there's inherent deficiencies in long-range forecasting, even out 5 days or more, and this goes out 15. So there's the basis for the AI to make the forecast starts with a model, okay? That's strike number one. Strike number two is when we take a look at the database of historical weather, going back to 1950 or so is good. I mean, that's good, but it's not as good as it could be if we had a bigger database of known weather, not only back to 1950, but it would be great if we could go back further, but we really can't because we just don't have it. We just don't have the ability to have any high degree of confidence before then to be able to build what happened on a global basis before then. But it's a really good start. And so what I like to see when I see an AI pattern versus the deterministic saying basically the same thing, well, then your confidence goes up that maybe the pattern that we see, this pattern change coming around the 18th or so, is likely to happen because historically this type of pattern has led to these changes. And when I see this tight gradient like this here, and I see this tight gradient here, even though they're not in exactly the same place, they're basically whistling the same song, the same tune. So there's a lot more to AI in the weather. I just kind of scratched the surface, but that's a basic interpretation of how it goes. You're going to hear more about AI, but remember that AI is going to be based on a model to start. So it's not necessarily something new under the sun. It's a good use of our computing power and a good use of AI, and it should get better over time. Have yourself a good Thursday. We'll see you Friday.